Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's talk about how Chinese and Western thinkers have knowledge-building traditions that are quite contrasting. As with the lecture of 2 weeks ago, this is going to be applied philosophy. In this case, applied philosophy of knowledge. So, first of all, it's important to understand that knowledge is at the root of everything we do. Essentially, we go with what we know, or more precisely, with what we think we know. And so knowledge has been a constant concern of philosophers the world over. And a few of them will be mentioned today in this lecture. So last week, we talked in another lecture of knowledge management as it was generally applied in management research. And essentially, I mentioned the SESI model that Nonaka concocted in the mid-90s. And although he was not the only scholar to import knowledge types from other fields, he's considered today to be the reference point with his 1994 paper. Other scholars who also discuss this are Headland in the same year, and Tsoukas. And one of the important points that Tsoukas makes in reaction to this newfound interest for knowledge types imported from psychology is that explicit and tacit knowledge are two sides of the same coin. In other words, there is no pure explicit knowledge or pure tacit knowledge, but rather what we see, what we observe, is related to the way we look at knowledge. So if we're looking into books, we'll only see the explicit knowledge. If we're observing people making things in practice, we will only notice tacit knowledge. So the duality of knowledge between explicit and tacit is comparable to the duality of light, which is both matter and energy. But if we're measuring waves, we will only see the energy part. If we're looking for light particles, photons, we will only see the matter part. So the same thing is true of knowledge. And so in philosophy, there are actually 4 kinds of knowledge, which I will describe in the next slide. And these types of knowledge have been identified by both Western and Chinese philosophers. In Chinese philosophy, practical, tacit knowledge has always been more important culturally. So there is actually more refinement in the types of tacit knowledge described and developed by Chinese philosophers. Conversely, conceptual knowledge, formal knowledge, explicit knowledge, codified knowledge, depending on who you read, has been more paramount in Western thinking, generally speaking. And so there are more refinements in the types of formal knowledge in Western philosophical tradition. But once again, these are 4 sides of the same knowledge. You cannot find in nature, so to speak, pure know-how or pure know-that or pure know-of or pure discernment. There are always facets of knowledge. So if I pursue the metaphor, instead of a 2-sided coin, we have a 4-sided pyramid. And depending on what you're watching for, you'll see a single type of knowledge. So what are these 4 types of knowledge? So in simple terms, in everyday terms, the 2 formal types of knowledge are knowledge of and knowledge that. So knowledge of represents the type of knowledge that we know of. So in other words, it's our language elements or vocabulary. So I can say, I know of Paris, I know of mathematics, but it doesn't make mathematics or Paris true or false. It's just something I'm acquainted with. This is what Bertrand Russell, for instance, calls acquaintance knowledge. It's the knowledge we're familiar with. Knowledge that, on the other hand, is factual knowledge, or in philosophical terms, and we can go back to Plato to find, if we want to quote the classics, and this is justified true belief. So it's knowledge that we know to be true. So for instance, when I say that Rabat is the capital of Morocco, and that I know that, what I mean is that I know that Rabat is the capital of Morocco is a true statement. And so that's an example of know that, knowledge that. On the tacit side, we have a general know-how, which is the ability in practice to ride a bike, deliver a speech, and so on and so forth. And there is a specific kind of practical knowledge that has been identified as early as Mozi, a Chinese philosopher whom I already cited last week, no, 2 weeks ago in the ethics lecture. And this is the ability to distinguish. For example, Mozi says that a good compass is a compass that can tell a circle from not a circle. And so this is where qualitative appreciation sets in within the realm of practical know-hows. This is where you are able to see good woodwork, for example, from bad woodwork. Or this is what is important in business when you're looking at patterns and trying to detect fraud, for example. The ability to tell that a task has been accomplished with quality is very important daily in business contexts. So what does this mean in practice? It means that the way that these types of knowledge combine is important, and the only good way to approach learning is to balance the 4 types of knowledge. If you don't cultivate know of, you will be faced with a static vocabulary, which means that you won't be able to map new concepts and evolve in terms of what you can think about. If you are unable to acquire factual knowledge, well, you'll be faced with evidenceless action, and that, as you can imagine, can be disastrous in a business context, because that means that you're basing your leadership on beliefs that are unchecked, and as I'm sure you appreciate, the greatest disasters come from the greatest convictions that were not checked in reality. I'm certain you all remember the sinking of the Titanic. Well, this is a classic textbook example of an accumulation of beliefs that were untrue. I'm not going to mention them all, but one of them was that there were no icebergs below a certain parallel. A second one was that the Titanic was unsinkable because you needed 5 compartments to be breached for it to sink, and so on and so forth. Had one of these beliefs not been invalidated by the tragedy that happened a century ago, the Titanic would have reached the Americas. If there hadn't been any icebergs below the parallel, if only 4 compartments had been breached, if communications between that ship and the surrounding ships had occurred smoothly, if operational communications had priority over telegrams from the customers, none of the tragedy would have been heavily mitigated, but that's not what happened, as we all know. So let's move on to the practical types of knowledge. So if you don't have know-how, well, you're unable to do anything, and that seriously limits your impact on your organization and on society. Even researchers need practical knowledge, although, as you know, universities are the realm of conceptual development. In practice, researchers need to be able to do data analysis, to do conceptual development in practice, not just build theories and never apply them. And finally, if you don't have discernment, you can't tell apart a good job or a good analysis from a bad one. And that, of course, leads to a lot of issues. And quality is, first and foremost, a leadership issue, for example. Because if the leader doesn't care about quality of your output, your product, your service, well, nobody else in the organization will care. So you need to be able not just to master explicit and tacit knowledge flows in your organization. You also need to understand what you can state, what you can, how you can think apart, what you can do, and how you can tell apart. So these are very important, the 4 of them, to have a balanced knowledge flow environment in your organization. So second dimension of knowledge that I'm going to address today is the sources of knowledge. Oops. So the sources of knowledge, there are 3 external sources of knowledge that both Mozi and Plato have identified in antiquity, and these are testimony, authority, explanation, rationality, and personal experience, empirical knowledge. So let me explain what these 3 are, although they're fairly straightforward. And any second-hand knowledge you get is in the first category here. So you learn from your parents, from teachers, hopefully, from the ancients, from the gods. There are many sources of authority and testimony, and of course, the trust relationship you have with the source of that knowledge, as well as the media by which that knowledge is carried to you, will factor into how you appreciate this knowledge. Second source of knowledge, and there's no particular order here, is the knowledge you create from exercising your internal logic. So typically, when you deduce something from other known pieces of knowledge, that is new knowledge you create in your mind. This is how, for example, Einstein developed the theory of relativity on the basis of an earlier experiment that demonstrated that the speed of light was the same in all reference systems. And so there are essentially 3 types of logic that are exercised. There is deductive logic, inductive logic, and abductive logic. So deductive logic is the logic which is the most mechanistic, the one where computers are generally perform better than humans. So if, for instance, you know that A implies B and B implies C, then you can deduce that A implies C. Inductive logic is the type of logic that is used, for example, by Sherlock Holmes in his classical tales. So Sherlock Holmes was able to induce from a stack of ash that it was a particular type of tobacco that created that ash, and in order to do that, he had his catalog of ashes that he'd produced and categorized, and so this is typically induction. It's not. It's something where computers, including in artificial intelligence, are sometimes performing better than us, but generally speaking, depending on the expertise, we're on par with computer systems, generally speaking. And finally, abductive logic is where most systems have trouble operating, and that's when we take something in one context and create new knowledge in a different context. So this is the area of metaphors, for instance, when we take in order to make sense of a situation, we use another context and we apply in the first context the lessons from the second context to make sense of things. Now, these are the main sources of external knowledge. There are two other sources that are sometimes operationalized in management research. And philosophers, of course, also explore these. The first one is emotion. So, for example, when I say I'm hungry, I create new knowledge in my mind that comes from inside me. It's innate. And there are a number of contexts in management research where emotions are operationalized. The most typical example is when mood is detected in customer relationships. So as you can imagine, the customer experience is very important to many businesses. And so detecting and modeling and shaping emotion is something that a lot of marketing scholars explore. And finally, in most cases, when we model memory, we imagine it to be perfect, that we have total recall, but that is not always the case. So when we want to model amnesia or imperfect recall, then we can do so. That means that when we call on our past knowledge, we can model it as imperfect recall that rather than perfect recall. So that's the fifth source of knowledge. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped personal experience, empirical knowledge. Of course, we also gain knowledge from our senses, and so that's the five senses, of course. And this is, of course, this is a main source of new knowledge for every individual. So one of the things that you can ask yourself is whether you favor one source or one type of knowledge over the other in your own knowledge building practice, and try to balance this by also paying attention to the others. Typically, people of empiricist tradition will favor personal experience over rationality and testimony. People who are more of a Cartesian tradition will favor rationality, explanation over authority and personal experience. And pragmatists may well favor following authority even just as a survival mechanism, even if what their personal experience and or what their logic informs them contradicts what authority is telling them. So how do we put all this together? Well, basically, language and vocabulary, know of, structures, or worldviews. In other words, language and vocabulary gives us the boundaries on our map. Then we fill in the map with or know that. What we know to be true or false or unknown or shifting and so on. And the combination of the two gives us our worldview and or practical knowledge or tacit knowledge is what helps us populate and draw the boundaries in this map. So these worldviews, of course, contribute to individual and collective decisions. And these decisions lead to actions and communications. And these actions and communications, or words and deeds in plain English, are what is observable. So in other words, everything else is a hidden part of the iceberg of cognition. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at ethics and values. And of course, values are what directs us to define our goals. And that is also an input to decisions. And we'll explore that more next week when we address the final chapter of this series of lectures with the logics part of ELK. So once again, self-understanding improves understanding of others. If we understand our biases in knowledge building better, we will be better armed, better tooled at understanding how other people who come from a different knowledge building tradition build knowledge differently, and that will improve our cross-cultural communication, and in this particular case, or cross-cultural or just interpersonal knowledge exchange. So here's now a little tool that can help you to improve knowledge exchange effectiveness. So I'm borrowing the Johari window from Loft and Ingham, who are two psychologists who developed this tool in the mid-50s. And essentially what they were interested in was or self-image in terms of psychological traits and the image that we projected on others. So I'm not going to talk about psychological traits, but instead look at knowledge. In many cases, you have someone speaking or writing, the locutor, and an audience. So the knowledge that both see is in the arena space. The knowledge that the audience sees, but that the speaker doesn't, is in the speaker's blind spot. The knowledge that the speaker fails to impart on his or her audience is the closed area. And finally, the knowledge that neither see, the unknown knowns, is in the dark area. And of course, in the dark area, we'll also find the unknown unknowns that Aristotle famously talked about, but this is something for another time. So let's take an example of a business plan submission, an example in a business context. So business plans have a particular feature is that the writers of business plans produce less business plans than the readers of business plans read, generally speaking. Whether you're submitting a business plan to a fund for investment or to a government body for a subsidy, the people who receive business plans read many more business plans than the people who author them. So it is not uncommon for the readers to be more professional than the writers in this context. And there are many other contexts where this is also true. The financial press is another example. So let's look at what kinds of knowledge that in this particular example, a fictional example, we have. So in the arena where both the authors of the business plan and the vetters of the business plan both see what's going on, well, we have an example of know of is it's quite clear that the writers of the business plan know of innovative pricing strategies. They also share factual knowledge on the demographics of their target market. And they also show that they have negotiation skills. That's part of their know-how. Now, in this particular case, it's very possible that the authors know of lock-in tactics, which is a particular technique to ensure stickiness to their technology. It's part of network effects for those familiar with this business context. And it's very possible that the readers of the business plan, the vetters, recognize that the authors have a strategy of lock-in, but that they fail to recognize it in practice in their business plan. So this is a case where the writers of the business plan have a knowledge, but they don't know they have the knowledge. And conversely, in this one, it's possible that the team who wrote the business plan understand formal intellectual property protection techniques. They know how to recruit and retain talent, and they have bicultural metacognitive capabilities, but they fail to show that in their business plan, so it's invisible to the readers of the business plan. So what to do, generally speaking, when you to raise your knowledge effectiveness? Well, when you have a script, the first thing you can do to push things from unknown to you to known to you is to critically review your business plan, your research grant application, your annual report, and ask others to review it too, to detect things that you might not have seen yourself if you're the author of the document in question. Second thing, and that's a very classical recommendation, generally speaking, is to show the knowledge you have rather than to tell your audience you have knowledge. So this is sometimes done through anecdotes, sometimes done, but it's always more convincing when you obliquely show the knowledge you have than when you just say you have it. Let's take an example of a CV. By putting down experiences where you put into practice your skills, you are showing you have a skill, just instead of just saying that you have it, which doesn't prove anything except that you're stating so. And finally, to push things out of the dark area into the arena, you need to learn and understand more. So that in turn increases the arena area, and so you have a higher throughput of knowledge, a higher efficiency in your knowledge exchange, and then you can, this is an unending effort. You can critically review your scripts again. You can show and not tell better stories, and you can learn and understand even more. And of course, there comes a point where the effort it costs more than the benefits of the effort. So you have to know when to stop doing this, and so on and so forth. So that concludes the lecture for today. And now on to you for questions. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the first question is the closed area. So let me go back to here. So so imagine that someone is trying to share knowledge with someone else. So the locutor is just a fancy word for speaker. And the speaker has an audience. So pieces of knowledge will fall, change. So some will fall in the arena where both see it. Some will fall in the blind spot, and some will fall in the closed area. So, and finally, some will fall here, but no one will observe these. So this list is impossible by construction to. So what kind of pieces of knowledge are in the closed area? Well, in the closed area, you'll find pieces of knowledge that the speaker has, but fails to share with the audience. So if I take my example, this is an example in a business plan where the fact that the authors knew of intellectual property protection techniques, formal intellectual property protection techniques, they failed to include that in their business plan. So they knew about them, but they didn't put them in the business plan. So of course, the readers of the business plan did not know that the authors knew about it. So this is typical of engineers who tend to underestimate the importance of legal arrangements, especially legal arrangements around innovation. So let me give you an example. There are 4 intellectual property protection techniques. There's patent for inventions. There's copyright for creations. So that includes, of course, creative works such as novels, movies, but it also covers software. Software is considered from a legal standpoint as a work of art rather than an invention. So if you're designing a new electrical engine, that would fall under the patent regime in your jurisdiction. But if you design the software to run on that engine, that is potentially copyrightable. And finally, the other 2 are registered trademarks. So an example of that is UM6P, the university which you see which you see in the background here, and also registered designs. So we have two designs here on this slide, this one and this one, and these are both registered designs. So say you have a business plan where you're launching a new e-commerce site, and you have a specific original way of finding products in your catalog. So a process that is something that can be formally protected. If you fail to include measures for registering that intellectual property, some readers of your business plan will consider that you don't understand formal IP protection techniques, and that might reduce your chance of being funded. Have I answered your question? Yes, okay. It's a sunny day today. Moving to the right there. Okay, tell us more about the unknown to locutor. Okay, so I can take the same example again. So perhaps I should explain what lock-in tactics are. Locking tactics occur when you have network effects in a particular market. So, for example, a network effect is something you have when the value of a product to a consumer is not just based on the intrinsic value of the product, but also on how many people use it. So, for example, Windows is the dominant operating system for personal computers. So people are more likely to, when choosing a personal computer, to opt for Windows, and that's called that's a lock-in effect. It's in the literature you can find this under lock-in or under dominant design. The textbook example of dominant design is the QWERTY keyboard. The QWERTY keyboard is a very old standard. It predates computers. It was the layout of typewriters. And today, if someone designed a new layout for keyboards with keys displayed differently, no one would be interested because everyone's locked into the QWERTY or AZERTY or QWERTZ, depending on the language and culture you come from. And there is no interest in adopting a new layout for keyboards today. Instead, what IT firms try to do is to insert a new interface that is closer and closer to the computer. So to the user. So after the simple keyboard of the typewriter came the keyboard of the computer terminal, and then the next innovation was, and that's always the case with human computer interfaces. The next break was the graphical user interfaces. That meant the introduction of the mouse and windows on the screens. Then what came next? Well, what came next was what we have now in an emergent form, and that's voice recognition. The reason big players in IT are looking at that is that it brings the interface even closer to the users through, and you don't need a keyboard anymore. And the next phase, which is already in production in some industrial contexts, is a brain-machine interface where they directly measure your brain waves. So would be a locking tactic? Essentially, if you become the de facto standard for voice recognition, everyone will adopt your solution, and you're locking in your customers. So if a better voice recognition technology comes later, and you have an installed base of users, you have an uphill battle, just as it's an uphill battle to uproot Windows in the operating system of personal computers today. So I imagine that in this business plan, the authors in their strategy, their strategic positioning, and their tactic of customer retention, they explained lock-in tactics, but they never used the term because they never recognized the theoretical aspect. So they understood it tacitly, but they didn't formally express it in the business plan in question. Another common example of things known that the authors of a business plan can be blind to is that they understand a market better than they know they understand a market, and that's something that can investors can recognize, and it can even be a disadvantage in negotiations that the investors take advantage of over the management team of the startup. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I will see you next week. And what we'll do next week is that we'll complete this picture. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about this. Today we talked about this, and next week we'll complete the picture with logics, and we'll also talk about how all of this triggers decisions. And as I said today, everything to the left of the blue line is the hidden part of the cognitive iceberg. So have a nice week, and I look forward to engaging with you next Tuesday morning.